What's up, family, and welcome to another video on my channel. As you can see, I had to stand up for this one. In this particular video, we're going to be talking about the tyranny of Christianity from a historical perspective. And honestly, this one might be a long one, which is the reason why I decided to stand up for this one. Um, wow. The majority of my life is sedentary. I sit in front of a desk for my job, for my work, and then I do this stuff, which is also sitting down in front of a camera. And so I wanted to kind of stand up, maybe burn some calories while I'm doing this. But I invite you into this conversation with me for a little bit. Cannot wait to hear your feedback and the dialogue for those of you who are engaging in good faith. Before we jump into this, I want to make sure that you like the video if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel. Consider joining our community either through Patreon or through our YouTube membership program. We're still building this thing out. You can also find us on Discord. Let's see here. Also consider volunteering in our community. We're really big about trying to build secular community, more places for people to safely deconstruct and deconvert. And then not just that, because I often say letting go of religion or leaving religion isn't just a letting go. It's also a opening up. It's a willingness to explore at your own capacity in this world around you. And so if you're interested in helping people do that, hey, a great way is to either volunteer for this channel or you can volunteer for our community organization, The Bridge and Bridge City. Okay. Oh, yeah. And we have merch. So, check out the merch. Do what you do. Do what you do. All right. So we're going to have this conversation. I think I've said everything that I'm supposed to say. We're going to have this conversation, and I want to walk through this thing. I do have a lot of notes here. And I put these notes together over the past few weeks, just some things that have been on my mind. And, the history of Christianity, first of all, has been greatly whitewashed. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this particular video. If you saw my most recent video, it was on this idea that Jesus is not actually good. Now, I'm not saying Jesus is the worst thing ever, but I'm saying when you actually read the gospel narratives without superimposing your presuppositions on the text, it's fairly clear that this guy is not necessarily a good guy. And just to drive that point home, Jesus never testified of himself that he was the good guy. As a matter of fact, he told his disciples, call no one good, not even me, for only your Father in heaven is good. All right, so enough of that. I want to also explain why this is in the Permission to Think series as opposed to any of the other ones. And because this could fit in any of the series that I've been doing on this channel. But it's on Permission to Think because that's exactly what this particular conversation is about, is actually thinking beyond the propaganda, thinking beyond what has been said, thinking beyond what has been asserted, and actually evaluating these claims. And as many of you know, that's precisely what I like to do on this channel, is see if these claims hold up, because even in the atheist community, we have so many things that we believe about the religious community that just do not stand up. One of those things that I've highlighted recently is we say that, religion gives people hope. I say, no, this is a claim that needs to be proven. And from a person who's had 2+ decades in ministry experience, weddings, funerals, ordaining folk, counseling folk, you name it, I didn't find a people who had hope, And I can use a scripture for that. There's a scripture that said, well, I'm not going to go there. Let's jump into this. All right. So yeah. So I'm putting this into Permission to Think because I believe it's necessary. Because there are people like Jordan Peterson who spout such foolishness as Christianity must be valid because of how long it's lasted in complete willful ignorance of the dehumanizing tools and measures it has resorted to in order to ensure its own survival. I would also like to stress on the onset of this video that this is not an exhaustive list. The things that I'm going to go through, I am absolutely positive that many of you will be able to highlight a plethora, an amalgam of things, a cornucopia, if you will, of things that I overlooked or did not mention. And I would love to see those things included in the comments, because the truth is, I'm afraid that the atrocities attached to this religion are as many as the grains of sands on a beach. So, all right, let's jump in. We're going to start, we're going to back up. We're going to go way back into time to the Roman Empire. We're going to start there with our historical traverse of the tyranny of Christianity. So, starting with the Roman Empire, the first thing I'd like to start with is the Edict of Thessalonica. Thessalonica should be somewhat familiar to you, though, for those of you who are believers and Bible readers. But the Edict of Thessalonica, issued on February 27th, 380 AD, by Emperor Theodosius the first of his name, along with co-emperors Gratian or Gratian, I don't know, don't really care, Valentinian II, declared Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Now, what's amazing about this is you'd be amazed in atheist circles, in Christian circles, and what I often call the conscious community circles. Everybody seems to get this one wrong. And that's primarily because so many people spend their time getting information from sound bites and echo chambers and propaganda than they do in actually verifying the claims. And I'm not saying that to make anybody feel bad. I honestly believe that this is what 90% of people do. This is how 90% of people engage the world. In many cases, it is our default position. But the edict mandated that all Roman subjects should adhere to the faith as taught by the bishops of Rome and Alexandria, thereby establishing a uniform religious doctrine. It condemned and labeled it condemned and labeled as heretical any divergent Christian beliefs, particularly those of Arianism, which denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. And just to drive that point home, that was a sect of early Christianity, Arianism. There were Christians who did not believe that Jesus Christ was divine. Early Christians, first, second, and third century, who lived in that area, lived during this time, lived in the culture of the context, who did not believe that Jesus was divine. The decree effectively marginalized pagan practices and other religious sects, leading to their persecution and the destruction of their temples and their scriptures, which of course is an assault on history itself. When I do the Bible study with an ex-pastor, I constantly try to stress and drive home this point that I am in no way a book banner. I'm not the person who says we should ban any book. I don't believe in destroying books. I don't believe that the Bible is a bad book. I believe that people who try to live by the Bible might not quite be all there. All right. So this significant shift not only unified religious practice under the state, but also set a precedence for the intertwining of church and state authority in the Western world. And just to kind of provide as a caveat, when I say you believe that people who try to live by this may not be all there, what do you believe that about you? I do. I absolutely do. I absolutely believe that when I was trying to live by this, I was not using all of my cognitive skills. No, there's no way around that. Okay. So let's just kind of highlight a few things that the Edict of Thessalonica led to. I would like to highlight a few things that are undeniably dehumanizing. So let's start here with the persecution of the pagans, which many believers who watch this video, which I don't know why they would, but they do. They just can't stop themselves from doing it, can they? But for they who watch this, many of them will literally say, and for the rest of you who will listen in on that folly, many of them will literally say, well, they're pagans. They deserve to be persecuted. And I highlight this because this isn't an ancient stance. This is a modern stance. Many Christians in America take that stance today. I often highlight, I don't remember the year, but there was a tsunami that hit Indonesia years back, maybe a decade or more or so. But I remember how many Christians who said, no, that should have happened because they were idol worshipers. Yes, Christians believe, many Christians, not all Christians, but many Christians believe that people who believe something differently than they do deserve to be punished by natural disaster on behalf of their loving God. You know, hey. But following the Edict of Thessalonica, there was a systematic persecution of pagan practices and temples throughout the Roman Empire. Pagan temples were destroyed or repurposed into Christian churches. Yeah. And public pagan rituals were banned, destroying people's humanity. Pagans who continued their traditional practices faced harsh penalties, including confiscation of property, exile, and even execution. This suppression led to the erosion of diverse religious traditions and cultural heritage. This is one of the many reasons that people like Jordan Peterson believes that Christianity just survived somehow. There was also the suppression of heretical Christian sects. I mentioned the Arians, but the edict specifically targeted Arianism, a belief system within Christianity that was deemed heretical for denying the divinity of Jesus Christ. Arian Christians were stripped of their civil rights, barred from holding public office, and subjected to violence and persecution. This included forced conversions, destruction of Arian churches, and the exile or execution of Arian leaders. This act of religious intolerance created an environment of fear and conformity, stifling theological diversity. Mm. And then there's also the establishment of the Inquisition to consider. While the formal establishment of the Inquisition occurred later, the Edict of Thessalonica laid the groundwork for institutionalized religious persecution by setting a precedent for state intervention in religious affairs. It paved the way for future inquisitions aimed at rooting out heresy. The Inquisition employed torture, forced confessions, and executions to enforce religious orthodoxy, resulting in widespread fear, suffering, and the dehumanization of those accused of heresy. I wanted to start with the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire is the earliest evidence of organized or institutionalized Christianity that we have. And there are many people who make this what I would just consider a bad faith argument that Christianity became violent recently. That no, it was just in the 1300s and the 1400s when it went bad. No, this thing has really been corrupt, like many people movements, from the very day that it started. The major difference is, much like Islam, is that anybody who dared to disagree were horribly ostracized, exiled, or executed. But that's enough for the Roman era. Let's move along a little bit and let's deal with the Catholic Church and the medieval period. Now, if we're going to talk about some of the heinous crimes that Christianity has committed, or crimes that have been committed, because Christianity is a tool, it cannot commit any crimes on its own. It is the people who use it. But what we are exploring here is historically how people have used it. So, the Catholic Church will start with the Crusades. Got to start there, right? Which lasted roughly around from 1095 to 1291. The Crusades were a series of religious wars initiated by the Latin Church, aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim control. And for those of you who say, "Well, no, this is not biblical behavior," the entire Old Testament is God sending people to war. Just remember that. But there was a series of religious wars initiated by the Latin Church aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim control. Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095, calling for Christian knights to aid the Byzantine Empire and secure Jerusalem. These campaigns led to widespread violence, including massacres of Jews, Muslims, and even Eastern Christians, as crusaders sought to impose their religious dominance. The Crusades resulted in temporary Christian states in the Middle East, but ultimately failed to maintain lasting control. Despite their religious justification, the Crusades had profound economic, political, and cultural impacts, fostering increased tensions between religious communities, much of that tension that we're still feeling today. So to just highlight a few events that are connected to this, let's start with the massacre of Jerusalem in 1099. During the First Crusade, after capturing Jerusalem in July of 1099, the Crusaders carried out a brutal massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Historical accounts describe how men, women, and children were indiscriminately killed, with reports of bloodshed filling the streets. This horrific event exemplified the extreme violence and lack of mercy shown by the Crusaders towards non-Christian populations. I think a lot of this stuff is important to remember because, especially in this country, you are seeing sentiments like that arise again. Just check my comments. There was also the siege and sack of Constantinople in 1204. The Fourth Crusade deviated from its original goal and, instead of reaching the Holy Land, ended with the sacking of Constantinople, a Christian city and the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders looted, raped, and murdered citizens, destroying a significant portion of the city and its treasures. This betrayal and violent conquest against fellow Christians deepened schisms between the Western and Eastern Christian churches. And then there was also the Rhineland massacres of 1096. As the First Crusade was being organized, bands of crusaders turned against Jewish communities in the Rhineland, which is modern-day Germany. Thousands of Jews were massacred in cities such as Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. I am not sure if I'm pronouncing those right. Driven by anti-Semitic fervor and the desire to eliminate what they saw as enemies of Christianity. Again, I find this to be absolutely relevant because of the prevalence of sentiments like this in American politics. This wave of violence against Jews is considered one of the earliest and most severe instances of organized anti-Semitic persecution in Europe. Gotta love those Christians, right? The next one is the Inquisition, which is also a part of this era, which we kind of highlighted earlier, but now it's officially kind of formalized in the 12th through 9th centuries rather. The Inquisition was a series of institutionalized efforts by the Catholic Church to combat heresy. And when we say heresy, what we mean is other people's right to believe something different. Yeah, to combat other people's right to believe something different and enforce religious orthodoxy. It began, excuse me. Yeah, this one is long, so there's going to be some coughing. It began with the medieval Inquisition in the 12th century, targeting Cathars and Waldensians, and later expanded with the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, focusing on converted Jews and Muslims suspected of secretly practicing their former faiths. Now, I've told you before in one of the shorts that one of the reasons I speak out as much as I do, because people say that Christianity it's your religions are personal, your religious beliefs are personal. And I'm like, Christian religious beliefs are not personal though. And that's what you see here from this historical analyst, this historical traverse, if you will, us walking through history, examining the tyranny of Christianity, is that every time we see Christianity raise its head as tyrannical, it is always an assertion of its right to assert its belief on other people. That's what this is. It doesn't have. That's how something becomes tyrannical, when it decides that what I think, how I feel is how everyone else must feel. It's just ridiculous to me. Even as an atheist, as a person who views other people who believes in fairy tales as delusional, and such was I at one point, even as an atheist, I have absolutely no desire to try to convert other people into atheism. Honestly, I only have a desire to help those who are on the fence, who are looking for it. All right, so where was I at? The Inquisition employed severe methods, including torture, forced confessions, and public executions, because, people got to see it, right? To extract confessions and punish heretics. These actions resulted in widespread fear, suffering, and the suppression of religious dissent. There's your answer, Jordan Peterson. The institution's long-lasting impact included the persecution of countless individuals and the establishment of mechanisms for controlling religious beliefs and practices. So, continuing in fashion, let's highlight a few things here that happened during this time that further kind of drive the point home. We'll start with the Albigensian Crusade. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that is from 1209 to 1229. This military campaign, initiated by Pope Innocent III of his name, aimed to eliminate the Cathar heresy in southern France. It led to the mass slaughter, you heard that right, slaughter of Cathars and sympathizers, including the infamous massacre of Béziers, sure I'm not pronouncing that right, where thousands of men, women, and children were killed. The brutality and indiscriminate nature of this violence exemplified the dehumanizing aspects of the Inquisition's effort to eradicate heresy. And again, heresy is the right for other people to practice their own beliefs. The Spanish Inquisition also came out of this part, which was during 1478 through 1834. This was established by Ferdinand II and Isabella I of her name. The Spanish Inquisition targeted conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, suspected of secretly practicing their former religions. Thousands were tortured to extract their confessions, and many were executed by burning at the stake. The relentless persecution created a climate of fear and suspicion, devastating entire communities and forcing many to flee or live in constant fear. There was also, and this one is kind of close to my heart, the trial and execution of Giordano Bruno in 1600. Bruno, an Italian philosopher and former Dominican friar, was tried by the Roman Inquisition for heresy due to his controversial ideas, including the belief in an infinite universe and the possibility of multiple worlds. After enduring years of imprisonment and interrogation, Bruno was burned at the stake in Rome. His execution highlighted the Inquisition's oppressive control over intellectual and scientific thought, suppressing dissenting views through extreme measures. Which again, some of that we're seeing an uptick in. This one is not a stranger to anybody, but there was also witch hunts that came out of this time from the 15th through the 18th century, possibly before and assuredly after. But the witch hunts spanning from the 15th to the 18th century were a period of intense persecution and execution of individuals accused of witchcraft across Europe and later in North America. These hunts were fueled by religious, social, and political factors, including the publication of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, don't know what that is, which provided guidelines for identifying and prosecuting witches. Well, that's what that is. Accused witches, often women, faced brutal interrogations, torture, and public executions, including hanging and burning at the stake. The witch hunts led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people and created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. This dark period in history is remembered for its widespread injustice and the dehumanization of those accused of witchcraft, almost exclusively women who did not submit. To kind of drive this point home, I want to highlight the Würzburg and Bamberg witch trials of 1626 to 1631. These trials in Germany are among the largest and most notorious witch hunts in history, resulting in the execution of hundreds of individuals. The accused were subjected to extreme torture to extract confessions and implicate others. Snitch on, colloquially, leading to a cycle of accusations and executions. Entire families, including children, were accused and killed, highlighting the indiscriminate and brutal nature of these hunts. There were also the more famous Salem witch trials that ideally lasted from 1692 to 1693. In the Puritan colony of Massachusetts, a series of witch trials led to the execution of 20 individuals and the imprisonment of many others. The trials were marked by mass hysteria, dubious evidence, and coerced confessions. The Salem witch trials are a stark example of how fear and superstition can lead to widespread persecution and injustice with devastating effects on the community. But see, there were also the Pendle witch trials in 1612. In Lancashire, England, 12 people were accused of witchcraft, with 10 ultimately hanged after a series of sensational trials. The accusations stemmed from local rivalries and were fueled by the testimonies of a 9-year-old girl. The trials exemplified how societal tensions and personal vendettas could be manipulated to accuse and convict individuals of witchcraft, leading to their dehumanization and execution. And shamefully, this one is not a lesson that we've truly learned from. Actually, none of these may be. But now let's talk about colonialism and the spread of Christianity. The very first thing that seems worth mentioning is the doctrine of discovery, becoming a prominent idea in the 15th century. The doctrine of discovery was a series of papal bulls, papal from the Pope, issued in the 15th century that provided theological and legal justification for European colonial powers to explore, claim, and exploit non-Christian lands and peoples, initiated by Pope Nicholas V. Bull Dum, yeah, I'm going to say it like that. It's probably Doom, but I want to say Dum Diversas of 1452, and expanded by subsequent bulls such as Romanus Pontifex of 1455 and Inter Caetera, which is probably Caetera, because that's how you pronounce AE, in 1493. These edicts sanctioned the seizure of territories and the subjugation of indigenous populations. The doctrine laid the groundwork for a European imperialism and colonization, leading to widespread displacement, enslavement, and cultural destruction of native peoples. It entrenched a mindset of racial and religious superiority that justified the dehumanization and exploitation of non-European societies. And again, calling your attention back to my most recent video on Jesus is not good, this is another great point to highlight that the Great Commission is instruction to colonize. I don't see how people don't understand that. It is instruction to colonize. Everything that we have walked through so far, for the most part, is either Christians doing what they believe is the right thing based on their religion, or people pretending to be Christians who are doing the right thing based on their religion. Either way, this is intolerable, and we should not allow this history to be whitewashed anymore. Let's continue. So, to kind of drive this point home, I have some areas to highlight. Let's start with the colonization of the Americas. Following Christopher Columbus's voyage, the doctrine of discovery was invoked to legitimize the Spanish and Portuguese claims to vast territories in what they called the New World. This led to the violent conquest, enslavement, and near genocide of indigenous populations, such as the Taino people in the Caribbean. The encomienda system forced indigenous people into labor under brutal conditions, severely impacting their societies and culture. But it doesn't stop there. This one hits a little close to home for me, and some of you probably already know where I'm going. The transatlantic slave trade, which I like to refer to in the broader sense as the Ma'afa, which is a word for the African Holocaust, because for whatever reason, in spite the superiority of numbers of African lives that were lost through this predicament, throughout this entire predicament, this is still often blackwashed in history as something minor. But The papal bulls underpinning the doctrine of discovery provided moral and legal backing for the enslavement of Africans. I mean, it's literally there. The moral and legal backing for the enslavement of Africans comes from the papal bull, comes from a papal bull, an issue, a decree from, at that time, the authority or leading authority in Christianity. European powers, particularly Portugal and Spain, used these decrees to justify the capture, transportation, and enslavement of millions of Africans, treating them as property. The dehumanizing conditions of the Middle Passage and the brutal exploitation on plantations has had long-lasting, devastating effects on African societies, domestic and abroad, and those devastating impacts are far-reaching. And just a little side note on history for those of you who do want to study the transatlantic slave trade, the Ma'afa, and you want to study it in good faith, not just levying these propaganda things. Oh, slavery was always there. I'd suggest that you start with the diaries of the first Europeans who landed in West Africa in Sierra Leone. And those were the Portuguese. And if you do not have the wherewithal to get your hands on the diaries, start with Wikipedia. All right, let's go. The next thing, and this one should be just as obvious because it fits into this category almost perfectly, and that is the seizure of indigenous lands in North America. And you know, just to kind of highlight here, this wasn't in my notes, but I want to make clear that this wasn't just North America. This was South America. This was Australia. Often when we talk about what's done to what's been done to indigenous populations across this planet, especially those of us in the US, we seem to think that it was just done in North America. And I'm like, oh man, you really need to go study what happened in Australia. You really need to go study what happened in Tasmania. You really need to go study what's happened throughout South America. You really need to study what happened throughout Central America. There's so much here to look at. You need to study what happened in Asia. And then it's just like the same way. People tend to think that the racial issue, the treatment of darker people, is something restricted to white folk, is something restricted to European societies. But apparently, it seems everywhere across this globe where darker people exist, there has been extreme mistreatment, prejudice, and discrimination. And again, I highlight Australia. I highlight the Philippines with the Negritos. Um, it's there, you know. And so I desire to have more nuanced conversations about those things. But so dealing with the seizure of indigenous lands in North America, the doctrine of discovery was used to legitimize European settlers' claims to indigenous lands, often without regard or existing native rights and sovereignties. This principle was later embedded in U.S. law, notably in the Supreme Court case Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823, which ruled that discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. This legal framework facilitated the displacement, forced removal, and systematic marginalizations of Native American tribes, i.e., the Trail of Tears. And as a person of mixed heritage from the South, from Alabama, mixed heritage from Alabama, some of you need to go look at some maps of what America looked like before there was a United States of America. You'd be surprised how many people were here before the Brits got here. But yeah, so this one, yeah, it's very interesting to me, and the way that these things, and this is why there are many groups calling for the separation of church and state, is because this is what happens when the state allows itself to intertwine itself with religious affairs. All type of atrocities get accomplished, you know. And so, yeah, let's continue. All right. There's also the Spanish Inquisitions in the Americas. And of course, the Spanish Inquisition extended its reach to the Americas in the late 15th centuries following Spain's colonial expansion. It sought to enforce Catholic orthodoxy among new colonial populations, particularly targeting converted Jews, conversos, and Muslims, moriscos. Think about that one. Suspected of secretly practicing their former faiths. The Inquisition also persecuted indigenous people, slaves, and settlers accused of heresy, witchcraft, or deviation from Catholic doctrines. Again, anybody who does not do what we do, anybody who doesn't believe what we believe. They utilize methods such as torture, public humiliation, and executions. The Spanish Inquisition aimed to consolidate religious and political control in the colonies. Its actions contributed to a climate of fear and oppression, significantly impacting the social and cultural landscape of the Americas. And to kind of highlight three things in here, and like I do, is the first thing that we see is the persecution of conversos and moriscos. Many Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity were accused of secretly practicing their former faiths. In Mexico and Peru, the Inquisition conducted rigorous investigations using torture to extract confessions and forcefully converting or executing those found guilty. This persecution uprooted families, created a pervasive atmosphere of fear, and led to the execution and exile of many individuals, stripping them of their rights and their dignity. There were also the trials of indigenous people. Indigenous populations were often targeted by the Inquisition for practices considered heretical or pagan. For example, in Mexico, indigenous leaders and shamans were prosecuted for continuing their traditional religious practices. The trials involved severe punishments, including torture and execution, aimed at eradicating indigenous spiritual beliefs and imposing Catholic orthodoxy. This suppression of native culture and religion led to the loss of cultural heritage and deepened the colonial subjugation of indigenous communities. Nothing has been more disrespectful of other people's right to religion than the tyranny of Christianity. I like the way I said that. That was dope. Okay. There's also the case of Francisco Núñez de Carabajal. In 1596, Francisco, a converso living in Mexico, was accused of secretly practicing Judaism. Despite her forced conversion to Christianity, she and several members of her family were subjected to the Inquisition's brutal methods. After enduring torture and a prolonged trial, Francisco was burned at the stake, exemplifying the extreme measures the Inquisition employed to enforce religious conformity. That's another one for Jordan Peterson. Her case highlights the dehumanizing treatment of individuals based on religious suspicion and the severe consequences of the Inquisition's relentless pursuit of orthodoxy. Now we're in the drug war, or the modern era, where we're going to start with the drug war. The war on drugs, initiated primarily by the United States in the 1970s, is a global campaign aimed at reducing illegal drug trade and consumption through law enforcement and military intervention. Declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971, the strategy has involved strict drug prohibition policies, harsh sentencing laws, and international cooperation to combat drug production and trafficking. Despite its intent to curb drug use and crime, the war on drugs has led to significant social and economic consequences, including mass incarceration, racial disparities in sentencing, and widespread violence in drug-producing countries. Critics argue the campaign has exacerbated social injustices and failed to address the root cause of drug addiction and trafficking. I include this one in this particular conversation because many of the impetus behind this type of movement has been based in religious ideals and this idea that we should have a right to police how other people live their lives. Starting with mass incarceration in the United States, the implementation of stringent drug laws such as the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which was the year that I was born, introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, disproportionately affecting African American and Latino communities. People literally had to grow up without mothers and fathers. Minorities faced harsher penalties for crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine, despite their pharmacological similarities, leading to significant racial disparities in incarceration rates. This has resulted in the long-term imprisonment of millions of nonviolent drug offenders, breaking apart families and communities, and perpetuating cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement, which I am a product of. There was also Plan Colombia. As a part of the U.S. efforts to combat drug production and trafficking, Plan Colombia provided military and financial aid to the Colombian government. The initiative focused on eradicating cocoa crops and targeting drug cartels, but also led to widespread violence and human rights abuses. Indigenous communities and small farmers were forcibly displaced, their livelihoods destroyed by the aerial fumigation campaigns, and the militarization of the anti-drug effort contributed to civilian casualties and exacerbated the ongoing internal conflict in Colombia. There was also the Philippine drug war, which has been taking place from 2016 to now. Launched by President Rodrigo, the Philippine drug war has been characterized by extrajudicial killings and human rights violations. The president's aggressive anti-drug campaign has resulted in the deaths of thousands of suspected drug users and dealers, often without due process, as is the case. Police and vigilante groups have been implicated in summary executions targeting mostly poor and marginalized individuals. The campaign has drawn international condemnation for its brutal methods and disregard for legal norms, highlighting the tyrannical aspects of the drug war. But moving on, there's also, in the modern era, the anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, which encompasses laws and policies enacted to restrict the rights and freedoms of LGBTQ plus individuals, often justified by religious beliefs, including those rooted in Christianity, primarily those rooted in the Abrahamic faiths. These laws have been implemented in various forms, such as banning same-sex marriages, prohibiting adoption, enforcing discriminatory employment practices, and criminalizing same-sex relationships. And I'd also like to remind people that there's still people in this country who believe it's okay to kill people who identify differently. Such legislation has led to widespread social stigmatization, legal discrimination, and violence against LGBTQ plus communities. Christianity's influence, particularly from conservative denominations, has played a significant role in promoting and sustaining these laws, which have profound negative impacts on the lives of LGBTQ plus individuals globally. To highlight some of these impacts, I like to start going back a little bit into time with the Buggery Act of 1533, enacted under King Henry VIII in England. The Buggery Act was one of the earliest laws criminalizing homosexual acts influenced by Christian doctrine that condemned such behaviors as sinful. The law mandated the death penalty for those found guilty of sodomy. This act set a precedent for the criminalization of homosexuality, leading to centuries of persecution and the dehumanization of LGBTQ plus individuals who were often subjected to brutal punishments and social ostracism. There was Section 28 in the United Kingdom from 1988 to 2003. Section 28 of the Local Government Act 1988 prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and in schools, reflecting the influence of conservative Christian groups in British politics. This legislation led to the stigmatization of LGBTQ plus identities, preventing educators from discussing issues or providing support to their students. The law created an environment of fear and silence, contributing to the marginalization and mental health struggles of individuals during its enforcement. There was also Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act. 2014. This is just 10 years ago. Also known as the Kill the Gays Bill. This should be humanly impossible. This literally should be humanly impossible. Also known as the Kill the Gays Bills, Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act imposed life imprisonment for same-sex relationships and mandated reporting suspected homosexuals, fueled by the influence of American evangelical Christian missionaries. The law intensified homophobia and violence against LGBTQ plus people in Uganda, leading to increased discrimination, persecution, and instances of mob justice. The act's passage highlighted the global reach of conservative Christian ideologies in shaping anti-LGBTQ plus policies, exasperating human rights and abuses. If I had one wish in this world, it would be that Christians would stay the fuck out of Africa. Obviously, there is also racial segregation. Racial segregation refers to the enforced separation of different racial groups in daily life, including in schools, housing, and public spaces, particularly prominent in the United States from the late 19th to mid-20th century. This system of institutionalized discrimination was upheld by laws and social practices that marginalized African Americans and other non-white populations. Certain Christian denominations played a significant role in supporting and justifying racial segregation using theological arguments to promote the notion of racial hierarchy and separation. These religious justifications for segregation contributed to widespread social and economic inequalities, reinforcing systemic racism and the dehumanization of non-white communities. To kind of bring some of these points home, I'd start with the biblical justification of slavery and segregation. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, many Christian denominations, particularly in the southern United States, used biblical passages to justify slavery and later racial segregation. The Curse of Ham narrative was often cited to argue that African Americans were divinely destined to be inferior and servile. This religious rationale provided moral and theological support for the establishment and maintenance of segregation laws, leading to the widespread dehumanization of African Americans and perpetuating racial discrimination. There was also the establishment of the infamous Jim Crow laws. Following the end of the Reconstruction era in the late 19th century, Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws enforcing racial segregation in all aspects of public life. Many Christian leaders and churches either actively supported or remained silent about these laws, reinforcing the social norm of racial separation. Segregation in schools, transportation, and public facilities were justified by the belief in the inherent difference and inequality of races, a view often bolstered by certain Christian teachings. This led to systemic disenfranchisement, economic disparity, and social marginalization of Americans in this country. There was also the opposition, grave opposition, if you will, to the civil rights movement. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, some Christian denominations and leaders actively opposed efforts to dismantle segregation. Groups like the White Citizens Councils, which included prominent Christian ministers, argued that integration was against God's will and used religious rhetoric to support segregationist policies. This opposition to civil rights advancements hindered progress towards racial equality and maintained a climate of hostility and violence against activists in African American communities, which we still see today. The resistance to desegregation further entrenched racial divisions and prolonged the struggle for civil rights. And while many of you are thinking, but yeah, that those were just white Christian churches who did that, and those are just the conservative white Christian churches who opposed the civil rights movement, I'd encourage you to go back and take a closer look at history. One of the things that I have to remind people is that Dr. King had to be somewhat forced to stand up for civil rights because it was not a thing in many of the churches that he was a part of the circles of. As a matter of fact, once he did, finally accept that mantle to step up and fight that right, and fight for those rights, it caused an absolute uproar in his denomination. There was literally a physical fight when he was nominated to be the president of that organization. As a matter of fact, the very church that Dr. King is known for is a church that absolutely fired the pastor before for those very same reasons. We don't want you standing up. And so one of the most disingenuous things about the history of the black church is the black church gets to pretend like it was on the front lines fighting something that it wasn't. And the majority of the times that it was there, it was its building, not its people. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There was also women's rights, which I feel like we have to deal with. The fight for women's rights encompasses the struggle for gender equality and the empowerment of women in various spheres, including political, economic, social, and personal domains. This movement has sought to address and dismantle systemic discrimination and barriers faced by women throughout history. While progress has been made, certain Christian denominations have historically opposed or hindered advancements in women's rights by upholding patriarchal interpretations of religious texts, or even asserting that those religious texts should have any relevant value. These interpretations have often justified gender inequality and restricted women's roles in society, contributing to the dehumanization and marginalization of women. We can start with the opposition to women's suffrage. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Christian denominations opposed women's suffrage, arguing that women's primary roles were as wives and mothers, and that political involvement would undermine these roles. Organizations like the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage included many members from Christian groups who used biblical interpretations to argue against women's right to vote. And it almost makes you wonder that if they didn't have a Bible to believe these things, would they have come to these beliefs? This opposition delayed the enfranchisement of women, contributing to their continued political and social marginalization. There was also resistance to the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. In the 1970s and 1980s, conservative Christian groups led by figures like Phyllis Schlafly and organizations such as the Eagle Forum vehemently opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. They argued that the ERA would dismantle traditional gender roles and family structures which they believed were divinely ordained. This resistance played a significant role in preventing the amendment's ratification, thereby maintaining legal and institutional barriers to gender equality in areas such as employment, education, and reproductive rights. Which brings us to the next point, the restrictions on reproductive rights. Certain Christian denominations have been influential in shaping laws that restrict women's reproductive rights, including access to contraception and abortion. Influenced by religious doctrines that emphasize traditional gender roles and the sanctity of life, these groups have lobbied for legislation that limits women's control over their own bodies. The impact of these restrictions include reduced access to necessary medical care, increased health risks, and the perpetuation of gender inequality by denying women the autonomy to make decisions about their reproductive health. In conclusion, the historical narrative of Christianity has often been whitewashed, obscuring the extensive dehumanizing actions carried out in its name. From the Edict of Thessalonica and the Crusades to the Inquisition, witch hunts, and the doctrine of discovery, the use of religious justification for oppression is undeniable. Modern-day issues such as anti-LGBTQ+ legislation, racial segregation, and the suppression of women's rights further highlight Christianity's influence in perpetuating inequality and suffering. This monologue serves as a stark reminder that despite arguments from figures like Jordan Peterson, the longevity of Christianity is not an endorsement of its validity, but a testament to its reliance on the oppressive measures for survival. Recognizing these atrocities is crucial and understanding the world as it truly is, allowing us to begin undoing the unnecessary damage and fostering a more just, equitable, and progressive society. That was a lot, right? But I wanted to share that, and I hope that you got some value out of this. As we're continuing to build up our channel, I'm hoping that we can build a production team, because I feel like this one needed some media. It needed some graphics. We needed to be able to walk through history and experience this timeline together. But thank you all, especially for those of you who stayed on to the very end. You have no idea how much I appreciate you and how much I appreciate your support. I will do my best to continue in this work. If you haven't already, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, consider joining our community either through Patreon, YouTube membership, Discord. Get in where you fit in, fam. And then also, if you want to volunteer to help create content like this, or you want to volunteer to help community, that's what we're looking for. I finally got it. We're looking for content volunteers, and we're looking for community volunteers. Content volunteers, you can sign up on our website, dldd.us. Community volunteers, go into the description of any Sunday sessions video, and you will have our forms there where you can sign up to volunteer. We also have some incredible merch that I encourage you to check out. Sacred Cow Grill Masters is one of my favorite. One of my favorites. I'm gonna get that one soon. But then also the Keep Rising one is absolutely beautiful, and Think Responsibly. So we have a lot of great stuff out there. Also, we have some fantastic, awesome things coming up. We're going to be launching the Ex-Pastor Call-In show the first Sunday in July. You don't want to miss that. And for those of you who are watching this in enough time, next week or this coming up Sunday, I will be on the Atheist Experience. I cannot wait to see you in the chat. I think that's all I have for you now. So I love you all greatly. And until next time, keep rising, stay progressive, and stay beautiful. I'll holla.